serial killer called me Mom? Aman allowed me to keep some extra paper today. He demanded I draw a picture of Neil Armstrong and him on the moon together. He says if it's not good, he's gonna gouge out my eyes. He probably didn't mean it. At least the 8-year-old part of him didn't. But that ancient thing sharing his skin like an ill-fitting suit? That part never makes empty threats. The drawing's finished now. I have maybe 2 hours before he slips away before school and those small feet pad down the concrete steps. 2 hours to write this, to fold it small and slip it behind the loose brick near my cot. 2 hours to explain why I know with absolute certainty that one day, Aman will kill me. I'll begin at the start. Shall I? Aman joined my 3rd grade class halfway through the school year. I had been taken aside by Misha, the admissions officer, the previous day. A young boy will be joining your class tomorrow, she told me in hushed tones after ushering me into an empty hallway. There's a few things you should know. The few things turned out to be a nightmare dressed as a police report. 3 months ago, a barefoot child had been caught ransacking the Quiet Dell service station, cramming potato chips into his mouth with mechanical desperation. He was rail-thin, fever-hot but ghost-pale, his face hollow where baby fat should have been. A service station attendant had to stop him from ripping open potato chip bags at will, cramming his face with Funyuns until his cheeks were bulging. The police were called, who spent the better part of 3 hours trying to get Aman to talk. No dice, Aman doesn't talk unless he wants to. It was an elderly woman who finally identified him. She'd seen him in the park with his mother, always after dark, always alone. Her voice shook as she gave the address, and she never once looked at the boy. Not once. I live on the same street, the lady explained tremulously. 8 Sycamore Circuit, behind the caravan park. The police bought him an ice cream, which melted untouched in his grip, and drove him to 8 Sycamore Circuit. The house was a dying Georgian, its weatherboards showing through peeling paint like exposed bone. Drought-killed grass hosted a graveyard of mud-caked toys and garbage. Now, Quiet Dell's no stranger to poverty, and these officers had returned plenty of children to less-than-ideal homes. The foster system was overwhelmed, and the few available families had reputations that made even condemned houses look appealing. So they stuck around and knocked for longer than they otherwise might have, and one constable skirted around the back of the house to peer through the kitchen window. That's when they found Aman's mother, Ms. Hutton. Dead? Misha explained, trying her best to look somber, but unable to hide that small-town thrill at the opportunity to gossip. Halfway out the kitchen like she'd been running from something. I've met her before, you know? Quiet, tiny little thing. Anyway, she was all smashed up. Chest opened right up, ribcage wide open, all her guts pulled out but still attached. And, this is the sick part, she was missing her heart. Maybe she picked up on the fact I was finding the relish in her voice distasteful because Misha quickly added, anyway, it's been a few months and they reckon he's stable enough to join the other students. He's a bit quiet, I'm sure you can imagine. Maybe sit him up the back. On his first day, Aman wore a second-hand uniform that hung off him like a deflated balloon. He had this strange way of walking. His head remained completely level and glided more than walked. When I introduced him to the class, 23 pairs of eyes fixed on him with the intense curiosity only 3rd graders can muster. Aman stared back, unblinking, until one by one the children looked away. By recess, they were already whispering. Lily Martinez told me Aman had stood perfectly still for the entire break, watching them play. He was counting, she said, tugging at her braids. Every time someone touched someone else, like tag or high fives, he was keeping score. Tommy Reeves swore Aman had followed him to the bathroom, standing outside the stall, breathing so quietly Tommy thought he'd left. until he opened the door to find Amon inches from his face. But I'd seen this before. My little brother Lucas had been different too, brilliant but unable to grasp the invisible rules that govern childhood friendships. I'd watched him stand alone at recess, memorizing playground patterns instead of joining in. The other kids had called him creepy too. So when I caught Amon lingering after art class, studying my demonstration porcupine with its popsicle stick quills and crayon details, I saw an opportunity. His focus was intense, head tilted at an odd angle as he traced each line with his eyes. "Would you like to show me what you drew, Amon?" He turned to me with that unervingly steady gaze. After a long moment, he retrieved his paper from his desk, holding it out with both hands like an offering. The drawing made my throat close up. Dark circles peppered the page like open wounds, each one meticulously shaded. They looked less like holes and more like mouths, descending into somewhere lightless. Between them, twisted figures writhed in positions that shouldn't have been possible. In the center, a small figure was bound in heavy chains. "Who is this?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "Me," said Amon. His dark eyes bore into me, as though measuring my reaction. "Why did you draw yourself like this?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Because that's what Mom did," he replied. "Oh, Amon, that's horrible," I said. I was no better than Misha. Curiosity bubbled on my tongue. "Do you know why she did this?" "To keep the wicked in." My heart broke for him. Here was a traumatized child, acting out through art the horrors he'd endured. I knelt down to his level and took his hands in my own. I remember jerking slightly at how hot his palms were, like he'd been warming them in front of a fire. "I know," I told him quietly, "that you had a tough time before you came here, but I want you to know it wasn't your fault, okay? And as long as I'm here, you'll always have a friend you can talk to." Then Amon's arms wrapped around my waist with crushing force. His face pressed into my stomach, and I felt him inhale deeply, like he was trying to memorize my scent. He hung on too long, too tight, like he was trying to emulate an embrace he'd never actually experienced. I remember thinking he was an odd kid at that moment, but a kid nonetheless, and my heart ached for him. Should have thrown him out the goddamn window. "You're not like her," he whispered into my shirt. "You're good. You'll be better." I patted his head awkwardly, trying to ignore how his fingers dug into my back like he was afraid I'd disappear. When he finally let go, 10 perfect bruises were forming on my skin. The first incident happened during spelling bee practice. Sarah Chun had just correctly spelled necessary, and I gave her a stamp on the back of her hand as a little reward. I didn't notice Amon's reaction, not then. But during recess, Sarah came to me absolutely hysterical, friends surrounding her with wide eyes and pale faces. She'd wrapped a scarf around her hand, the blood-staining cornflower blue cotton a deep purple. After enough coaxing, she agreed to show me. All my insides froze. "He said I had to get it off," she hiccuped. So he held my hand against the brick wall and kept scrubbing until the star was gone. When I confronted him, Amon just stared at me with those unervingly steady eyes. "Then why did you give it?" he asked. "If you knew it would upset me?" He was suspended for 3 days. But he'd had a brutal upbringing. He was just a child. Sarah Chen's parents were surprisingly lenient. They left it at that. No counseling, no behavioral checks or special support. Nothing. After that, the other children learned to reject my rewards if Amon was watching. They'd shake their heads quickly, eyes down, mumbling "no thank you," before hurrying back to their seats. But it wasn't just about stamps anymore. A week later, Tommy Reeves made the mistake of asking me for help with his math during lunch break. I found him an hour later locked in the supply closet, a crude message scratched into his arm with a pencil. Miss Tilly is busy. When his parents threatened to press charges, Tommy changed his story. Said he did it to himself. He switched schools the next week. Lily Martinez brought me an apple one morning. Her family had an orchard, and she was always sharing the harvest. By afternoon, she was in the nurse's office with stomach cramps. They found pieces of glass in her lunch bag, mixed in with her sliced fruit. Tiny, methodical fragments that could only have been placed there deliberately. His attachment grew stronger. He'd wait by my car each morning, though his foster family dropped him off an hour before school started. He began leaving drawings on my desk, endearing ones at first of us together in various settings. But they warped over time. In some, we were underground in candlelit rooms. In others, we were alone in the world, everyone else just shadowy figures in the background. When I hung other students' artwork, he'd scratch their names off, replacing them with his own. I was grateful when Michael suggested dinner. A chance to pretend everything was normal, to focus on something other than Amon's increasingly possessive behavior. Michael looked handsome in his police uniform, fresh off his shift. Being with him felt safe. About 4 glasses of wine in, I started to tell him about Amon's behavior, about the injured children and the drawings. Looking back, I was unsettled but not terrified. He was little more than a child, after all. Lonely and damaged. Maybe if I'd taken the glaringly clear signs at face value, I wouldn't be here today. Michael let me finish, then leaned across the table. Listen, there's something you need to know about Amon's mother. He glanced around the restaurant before continuing. You remember that cult? They got compounds all over America. Phoenix, Utah. Hell, just down the road in Driftwood. The Brides of Christendom, I said immediately. Of course I knew. They were notorious. Members came knocking on my front door at least once a month. Well, continued Michael, she was a runaway. You're kidding. Nope, said Michael, leaning back in his chair and grinning, pleased by my surprise. And she might have gotten away, but a lot of that shit stuck around. I guess she couldn't quite shake whatever she went through in that cult. Lorraine Hutton was one sick lady. What do you mean? He leaned across the table, voice low. There was a room in the basement. We found journals. She documented everything. Detailed logs of the treatments she would put him on through. I swallowed. Do I want to know? You don't. But I'm telling you anyway. She'd chain him up to this metal chair custom-made, child size. She'd leave him shackled there for days, reciting biblical verses. Latin exorcist type stuff. She counted his calories, too. They were way too low. I swear to God, it was like she was challenging herself to see how low she could go without killing the boy. We also found prayer boards studded with nails, and she'd make him kneel on them. Covered my mouth. Oh my God. It gets worse, he continued grimly. We found this device, he trailed off, looking past me. I turned. Amon stood at our table, perfectly still in a too large dress shirt, his foster family hovering uncertainly behind him. The change in temperature was immediate, not supernatural, but the kind of cold that comes from pure, concentrated rage. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Michael tried to smile. Hey buddy, how are? My mother used to pray too. Amon interrupted softly. Still staring at Michael with such open loathing, I was surprised his face didn't melt off. Right until the end. Even when I was pulling things out of her. Amon, I said sharply. Don't joke like that. Are you fucking him? Amon demanded heatedly, jerking his pale head at Michael. Amon, cried his foster mother, a vaguely familiar woman named Anne. Serial foster mother in it for the checks. A couple of my kids had lived under her roof, as they never quite lost that hungry, stray dog look about them. and placed a beefy hand on Amon's shoulder and shot me a look of extreme mortification. "I'm so sorry," she said. "He's doing much better these days, but sometimes—" "Let's go, Amon. Come on. We'll order you something nice." She steered him away and Amon went willingly, though he continued to stare back at us over his shoulder. Before I could process everything, a small voice piped up beside me. The foster family's youngest daughter had lingered behind, twisting her pigtail nervously. "Are you Miss Tilly?" she whispered. "Yes, I am." "You're Amon's mom?" I blinked. "No, I'm not." "Oh," she hesitated. "He says you are. You should be careful. He didn't like his last mommy." That night I woke suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. The house was silent except for the autumn wind rattling branches against the windows. Michael lay on his side beside me, his steady breath a familiar rattle. Something felt wrong. You know that feeling when your hindbrain recognizes danger before your conscious mind catches up? That primal instinct that makes your skin prickle and your mouth go dry? I lay there in the dark, debating whether to wake Michael. Told myself I was being ridiculous. I was on edge. Then I thought I heard footsteps. Now, our old Victorian house was infamous for its eerie creaks and groans. It was like living inside the intestinal tract of some great creature. I'd been living there so long. My palms no longer welled with sweat and my mind didn't automatically jump to dark shadows in corners and eyeless women hiding under my bed. But those steps sounded so clear. Being crazy, I told myself. The stairs creaked as I made my way downstairs, my bare feet silent on the hardwood. Each step felt like a mile. The living room was bathed in strange shadows from the streetlight outside, making familiar furniture look twisted and foreign. Wind howled through the ancient ventilation system, creating sounds almost like whispers. I followed their chatter through the empty kitchen, the cavernous living room, and came to a stop in the moonlit hallway. The front door stood wide open, autumn leaves scattered across the welcome mat. My heart thundered in my chest as I approached it. Just the wind, I told myself. The house was built in '52, and the door latch had always been temperamental. Still, my hands shook as I pushed it closed, twisting the deadbolt with perhaps more force than necessary. The walk back upstairs felt longer, darker. I found myself checking over my shoulder every few steps, though I couldn't say why. When I finally reached the familiar darkness of our bedroom, relief flooded through me. Michael was still and exactly as I'd left him, one hand tucked under his pillow. No longer snoring, thank God. I settled beside him with a shaky little laugh, then felt something hot and wet against the back of my neck. I froze, hand inching toward the bedside lamp. Light flooded the room. I screamed. The sheets were soaked crimson, spreading outward from Michael's chest like a blooming flower. Where his sternum should have been was a ragged cavity, hollow and dark. And there, sitting on my pillowcase, still warm and dripping, was his heart. Beneath my guttural screams, I heard Admission Officer Misha's voice like a distant echo in my head. "And this is the sick part," she told me. She was missing her heart. I spent that night in the police station, Michael's blood drying in the creases of my hands, my clothes, under my fingernails. They'd given up trying to get me to change out of my nightgown. My voice was hoarse from screaming, but I couldn't stop talking, couldn't stop trying to make them understand. "You don't understand," I kept saying, rocking back and forth. "You didn't see him with the other children. The things he'd do when someone got too close to me." The detective shook his head. "Ms. Tilly, the damage done to your husband's body. It was extensive, brutal. We're talking about injuries that would require significant physical strength. No child could have." No matter what I said, I could not convince them. Michael's murder remains unsolved to this day. 2 months passed in a haze of police interviews and sleepless nights. I hadn't stepped foot in the school since Michael's death. Couldn't bear to face those tiny desks and cheerful wall displays. But Quiet Dell was a small town with limited options, and Michael's life insurance barely covered the funeral costs. Bills kept arriving with mechanical persistence, each one a ticking reminder that I couldn't avoid reality forever. I slept in the living room now, on a worn couch facing the TV. The stairs leading to our bedroom might as well have been a mountain. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring up into that darkness, remembering the wet warmth of Michael's blood, until my throat closed up and I had to turn away. The job search was futile. Quiet Dell's economy consisted of the school, a grocery store, and a handful of family-run businesses that had been passed down for generations. After the third rejection, I knew what I had to do. The house needed work before I could sell it. New carpets upstairs, fresh paint to cover the memories, and that meant money, which meant returning to school. The administration was sympathetic, almost embarrassingly so. They agreed to let me finish out the school year, accepted my resignation effective June, and promised I wouldn't have to teach him on. "He's in Mrs. Peterson's class now," the principal assured me. "You won't have to interact with him at all." I'd expected to see a monster when I finally encountered him in the hallway. Some hint of the darkness I was certain lurked behind those eyes. Instead, he barely glanced my way, absorbed in conversation with 2 other boys. He looked normal, happy even. The doubt crept in slowly, poisonous. Had grief warped my memories? Made me imagine impossible things? The months crawled by. My students seemed subdued, maybe their usual exuberance dimmed, but not the reign of terror I had seen in those earlier months. On multiple occasions I spotted Amon out on the playground, playing boisterously with boys his own age. He would regularly pass me in the corridor, shoot me a quick, "Hey, Miss Tilly," before bounding after his friends. I began to question myself. I was torn between a gut-deep belief that something was intrinsically wrong with the gaunt little boy with the dead cultist mother, and a sense of self-admonishment that I had possibly blamed a completely innocent 8-year-old boy for the death of my boyfriend. On my last day, my students brought flowers, bright bouquets of dandelions and wild daisies, grocery store carnations clutched in sweaty hands. My desk disappeared under the offerings, a farewell shrine of childhood affection. Then Amon appeared in my doorway during lunch break, a piece of paper held carefully in both hands. "I made this for you," he said, the first words he'd spoken to me in 6 months. The drawing showed 2 figures sitting close together in what looked like a basement or cellar, surrounded by strange shapes I couldn't quite make out. We were both smiling, my arm around his shoulders. The longer I stared at it, the more wrong it felt, like staring at your own reflection too long until it becomes a stranger's face. "Thank you, Amon," I said as a parting offering. Whatever. I was leaving Quiet Dell, and I was never looking back. The moving company had come the previous day. The house had sold quickly, below market value, but I didn't care. My college roommate had offered her spare room until I got back on my feet, a lifeline I grabbed with both hands. I couldn't spend another night in this town. I returned just long enough to pick up my old convertible, stuffed with what little belongings I deemed worth saving, and took bitter pleasure watching the "Welcome to Quiet Dell" sign shrink on the horizon as I left it behind. The roads were empty as I drove out of Quiet Dell, my headlights cutting through the darkness. My phone's GPS promised 8 hours to Monica's house. I could make it by sunrise if I pushed through. The trees pressed close to the road, their shadows making strange patterns in the high beams. Then a small figure stepped into the road, and my world turned sideways. I yanked the wheel hard, tires screaming against asphalt. The world spun in lazy circles through my windshield. Trees, road, sky, trees again. before ending in a violent crunch of metal and glass. Pain bloomed across my chest where the seatbelt caught me, and something warm trickled down my face. Through the spiderweb of my shattered windshield, I saw him approaching. The headlights caught his small frame, casting long shadows behind him that seemed to writhe and twist with each step. My head was spinning, vision blurring at the edges, but I could see his smile clearly. Too wide, too knowing. He appeared at my window, pressing one small hand against the cracked glass. The shadows behind him grew darker, larger, consuming the weak light of my ruined headlights. "It's okay, Miss Tilly," he whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "We're going to be a family now." The darkness swallowed me whole. I came to with the taste of copper in my mouth and cold cement against my cheek. The room was large, windowless, filled with shapes that resolved slowly into terrible clarity. Chains hanging from ceiling hooks, tables with restraints, things I couldn't name but whose purpose was written in their sharp edges, and cruel curves. A child's drawing come to life. "You're awake." Amon's voice, bright with genuine joy. He knelt beside me, reaching out to brush hair from my face with gentle fingers. "I was worried I'd hurt you too badly, but I was careful. I've gotten better at being careful." "Why?" My voice cracked on the word. "Because you're going to be my new mom," he said, as if it were obvious. "My last mom taught me wrong. She thought the machines could keep the bad parts locked away, but they just made them stronger. But you're different. You understand me. And if you're good, if you really love me, I won't have to hurt anyone else. Not my foster family, not the kids at school. They can all stay alive." The worst part was his sincerity. The desperate need for connection warring with something ancient and hungry behind his eyes. I thought of Michael's chest torn open like paper, of Ms. Hutton's missing heart, of all the small cruelties I'd witnessed and dismissed. "Of course I'll be your mom," I whispered, and watched his face light up with terrible joy. Our days fell into a routine. He'd visit before school, bringing McDonald's breakfast or stolen Pop-Tarts, chattering about his classes while I ate. His foster family never questioned his absences, not after what happened to their rabbits. He'd spend hours after school curled against my side like any child seeking comfort, while I stroked his hair and told him stories and pretended this was normal. This was love. Sometimes he'd ask me to use the machines on him, his mother's legacy of pain and restraint. To keep the wicked parts quiet, he'd explain, tears in his eyes. "I don't want to hurt you like I hurt her. She didn't understand, but you do. Right, Mom?" I comply, telling myself it was survival. That each day I kept his attention focused on me was another day his classmates went home safe. Another day his foster family's pets stayed alive. Another day I might find a way out. But there were moments, becoming more frequent, when the mask would slip. When the thing wearing a child's face would look at me with eyes older than time, hungry for more than a mother's love. Those were the moments I understood what his real mother had tried to contain, what she died trying to control. I don't know how much longer I can keep him satisfied with this twisted domestic fantasy. How much longer before the creature wins over the child. I'm writing this down so someone will understand, will know what to look for if, when I disappear like his mother did. Because Amon is still growing, and his appetite grows with him. And you want to know the really worrying part? He tells me there are others just like him.